The cold of December 1940 did not simply settle over London. It crawled into every broken window frame, every collapsed cellar, every exposed stretch of brick still warm from the fires of the night before. The city breathed in short, smoky gasps, as if unsure it could endure another dawn. Wet fog clung to the ruins, absorbing the scent of ash and pulverized stone, and even the distant rumble of passing fire engines felt muffled, swallowed by the wounded streets. In this gray silence, Winston Churchill walked almost alone, the weak glow of a street lamp flickering behind him, his pace steady but heavy, as though each step pressed deeper into the weight of the war. His overcoat, damp at the shoulders, carried a metallic odor of the night's embers. The charred smell lodged itself in his throat. The usual warmth of a cigar, a small ritual that often steadied his hands and thoughts, had faded entirely, the tip cold, forgotten, bowed by grief rather than extinguished by wind. He kept it between his fingers out of habit more than comfort, as if its familiar shape might anchor him amid the devastation stretching out on both sides of the narrow road. He had been warned not to come. Another bombing run was still possible. The Luftwaffe had made a habit of returning to sites they had already hit, exploiting the disorientation of rescue crews. His security detail had argued that wandering through unstable structures by lantern light was reckless, unnecessary, symbolic at best. But Churchill could not stay in a warm room at Downing Street when an entire neighborhood lay broken. Leadership, he believed, demanded presence, not in speeches or broadcasts, but in footsteps echoing to the same shattered streets the people walked. As he approached the remains of a small square he remembered from years earlier, a place where children would chase pigeons and mothers would chat on benches beneath bright windows, he felt a deep, familiar sting. Guilt, that quiet old companion. It arrived without ceremony, slipping past his defenses more easily than enemy planes passed the night's anti-aircraft fire. He had spent years being underestimated, dismissed as too forceful, too erratic, too hungry for conflict. And now, in the hour when he finally held the weight of national survival in his hands, he felt the ancient fear that even his fiercest resolve would not be enough. He could not protect every home. He could not shield every family. Every new stretch of ruin carved another line into the private ledger he kept within himself, the one no one else would ever read. He paused near the edge of what had once been a bakery, its brick facade peeled open like a wound. The floor was carpeted with blackened timber and glass. A twisted metal sign hung by one hinge, tapping softly whenever the faint breeze changed direction. Churchill's breath steamed in the air as he surveyed the destruction, his eyes narrowing not with anger but with calculation, with the mental instinct of someone who had spent time on battlefields long before politics claimed him. Shapes, angles, fault points, they arranged themselves in his mind with tragic clarity. A rescue officer jogged toward him from the far end of the square, helmet dusted with soot. Behind him, lanterns bobbed like tiny yellow stars amid the dark. The young man saluted, then hesitated, unsure how to deliver the news. Churchill nodded for him to continue, bracing himself. "There's an unlisted shelter beneath this block, sir," the officer explained. "A civilian one, not registered with civil defense. We think a dozen people may still be alive down there, but the buildings above, they're unstable. Engineers are requesting further assessment before we attempt extraction. Orders are delayed." Delayed. The word struck harder than the news itself. Bureaucracy was a necessary machine, but tonight its gears were grinding too slowly. Churchill looked past the officer, toward a cluster of crumpled houses leaning together like exhausted survivors. Somewhere beneath them, men, women, maybe children were breathing stale air, waiting in darkness that grew thinner by the minute. How long before the top levels collapse? Churchill asked quietly. The officer swallowed. "Minutes or hours, sir. The structure's unpredictable. Any vibration could bring it down." Churchill nodded, but his thoughts were already threading into the ruins. He saw the way the walls had sheared at angles rather than fallen inward. He noted where fire had licked through upper floors but spared the deeper layers. And then, somewhere in the fog of memory, older fragments surfaced, his days covering distant conflicts as a correspondent, sketching blast patterns in notebooks, learning how pressure waves traveled through old brick versus newer stone. knowledge he had not summoned in years, yet now it presented itself with sudden clarity. What about the adjoining building? Churchill asked, pointing at a half-standing structure whose first floor remained strangely intact. Too risky. If it gives way, it'll seal the shelter completely. Churchill stepped closer, squinting up at what remained of the second story. The bricks near the base were discolored but unwarped. Fire had swept overhead, sparing the lower supports. The building, though wounded, still held a backbone. "A lateral path," he murmured. "Through that wall." The officer blinked. "Sir, with respect, the engineers say that it's unstable." Churchill finished for him. "Yes, but not fatally. Not yet." Another gust of cold swept through the square, scattering dust like drifting snow. Churchill's coat flapped open at the sides, and for a moment he looked less like a statesman and more like a solitary figure pulled between duty and danger. His pulse tightened with a quiet resolve. "Gather a small team," he said. "Lanterns, braces, anything that can shore up the passage. We're going in." And before anyone could protest, he stepped toward the ruins, driven not by recklessness but by the absolute belief that hesitation was the true enemy tonight. The square lay in a hushed half-light, lit only by a lantern beam slicing through drifting sheets of dust. As Churchill moved toward the damaged building, the rescue crew exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to challenge him or simply follow. Most chose the latter, not out of obedience to rank, but because there was something in his posture, a heavy, steady determination, that made inaction feel morally impossible. It was as though the devastation around them had found its equal in the unspoken weight he carried inside, and no one wished to stand between that burden and the lives still trapped beneath the rubble. Inside the fractured structure, the temperature dropped even further. Damp cold clung to the walls, and every exhale hung briefly in the air before dissolving into the darkness. The lantern Churchill held trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the faint tremor in the floorboards as debris settled in the distance. The building moaned around them, an old, wounded thing protesting intrusion. Churchill listened to those creaks with the trained instinct of a man who knew that structures, like people, issued warnings before they failed. The first room they entered had once been a sitting room. A collapsed fireplace lay in a heap against one wall, and strips of wallpaper peeled downward like wilted leaves. Churchill swept the lantern over the floor, noting where the blast had pushed through the back wall. The lateral path he envisioned would run adjacent to that breach, exploiting the gap while avoiding the dangerously fatigued beams overhead. He crouched, touching the cold brick with gloved fingers, feeling for vibration, the subtle pulse of a structure under strain. It was holding, barely, but holding. Major Ellison, one of the senior engineers on site, forced his way into a room behind him, breathless and visibly agitated. "Prime Minister, this is highly irregular. We haven't cleared this structure. One wrong shift in weight." Churchill lifted the lantern to meet his eyes. "Major, if we wait for full analysis, we may be retrieving bodies instead of survivors. Help me assess the load distribution along this wall." Ellison hesitated. He was a man bound to procedure, to training, to predictable systems. But the urgency in Churchill's voice cut through that framework. With a tight nod, he knelt beside him, running a hand along the cracks, tracing the spiderweb fractures radiating outward from the blast point. "The fire weakened the upper levels," Ellison said, voice low. "But the lower masonry, it's old hand-fired brick, denser than modern stock. It may hold a narrow passage. Enough for single-file extraction? Possibly, if we reinforce from the rear." Churchill exhaled slowly, not relief, but confirmation. His instincts had not deceived him. "Then we proceed." As the team gathered braces, wooden supports, and cutting tools, Churchill stepped back toward a shattered window frame, stealing a moment to look out at the ruined street. Snow had begun to mingle with the ash, forming pale specks that drifted downward to the glow of distant fires. London had become a city of ghosts tonight. Silhouettes of chimneys, outlines of broken walls, shadows of what once was. And yet among those shadows lived courage, stubborn and quiet, refusing to yield. While he watched, memory crept in uninvited. He saw himself years earlier, in the sands of Sudan, notebook in hand, scribbling observations about explosions and cavalry charges under the harsh sun. He had been reckless then, too young to fear death properly, too eager to prove worth. Now, he feared failure far more than danger. Lives depended on judgment, not bravado. Every decision carried a price he would count long after the war ended. A soft clatter pulled him back. The crew was assembling near the intended breach point. Ellison tested the stability of the braces, instructing 2 men to anchor them at precise intervals. The lantern light wavered, casting long, jittery shadows across the cracked wall. Churchill approached them, rolling his shoulders, attempting to ease the stiffness that had settled there since morning. "Gentlemen," he said, voice steady, "we move carefully, no sudden impacts. The structure will give us minutes, perhaps more, if we show it respect." One of the younger rescuers, barely older than 20, swallowed hard. "Sir, with you leading, do we proceed even if the readings are uncertain?" Churchill regarded him for a moment. Fear was etched plainly across the boy's soot-stained face. Yet beneath it flickered a spark, the will to do what mattered. Churchill lowered his voice. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is a choice to act despite it. Tonight, others depend on that choice." The boy nodded, jaw tightening. The first cuts into the wall began cautiously. Each strike sent a ripple of dust into the air, settling on the rescuer's shoulders like gray snow. Churchill monitored the ceiling constantly, listening for changes in the pitch of the groans above. Twice he ordered the men to stop, each time detecting a subtle shift, a brace asking for adjustment, a beam beginning to slump. Ellison moved quickly to compensate, sweat mixing with soot on his forehead. The gap widened inch by inch, revealing a narrow cavity beyond. The lantern's glow reached only a short distance into it, illuminating floating dust particles that shimmered like fading sparks. The air smelled of wet stone and stale smoke, heavy with trapped hours. Churchill leaned closer, angling the lantern. The space beyond sloped downward, the beginning of the lateral path that would lead them toward the unlisted shelter. It was tight, but navigable. A distant crack thundered through the upper floors. The ceiling above them shuddered, sending a thin rain of grit downward. Several men instinctively stepped back. Churchill's heartbeat quickened, but his tone remained calm. "Hold the braces. Redistribute weight to the left beam. We continue." Ellison shot him a quick look, part respect, part disbelief. Most men in Churchill's position would have stepped outside, allowed the crew to proceed alone. But Churchill stayed at the front, lantern in hand, guiding by instinct and sheer force of will. After several more minutes, the breach was finally large enough for passage. Ellison signaled readiness. "Prime Minister, with respect, you should let us enter first." Churchill shook his head. "Time is our enemy tonight. I know the layout best." And with that, he lowered himself through the opening, boots scraping softly against debris, lantern cutting through the darkness ahead. The narrow space swallowed him quickly, shadows wrapping around his figure until only the warm, trembling glow marked his position. Behind him, the rescuers exchanged a look, half fear, half awe. Before following, they felt, each of them, that they were stepping not just into rubble, but into the quiet gravity of decision made by a man who understood that leadership sometimes meant being the first to walk into danger. The corridor beyond the breach swallowed them in a dim, oppressive silence, the kind that seemed to coat the air itself and cling to their clothing as they pushed deeper inside. Churchill led the way with the lantern held close to his chest, its unsteady glow carving narrow ribbons of light across the cracked walls. The air felt colder here, damp with the residue of trapped smoke and old mortar, and each breath carried a faint mineral taste. The narrow space forced the team into single file, their boots grinding softly over scattered debris, and every sound, every clink of metal, every shift of brick, echoed with an unsettling intimacy. Churchill moved slowly, not out of fear, but out of the instinctive awareness of someone who had spent years reading broken landscapes, and he listened to the muted groans of the structure as carefully as a doctor listening to a patient's failing heartbeat. The ceiling descended so low at points that he had to duck, his coat brushing the core stone, and once or twice he placed a steadying hand along the wall, feeling for tremors, tracing where the load still held and where it threatened to give. Major Ellison kept close behind him, occasionally checking readings from a small vibration gauge, though the cramped passage allowed little room for tools or proper assessment. When he whispered that the oscillations were becoming irregular, Churchill merely nodded and pressed forward with a quiet conviction that hesitation was now the greater danger. He was aware of the risks. Every man there was, but he also sensed the proximity of life. The air was growing warmer the deeper they advanced, carrying faint traces of human breath. It struck Churchill with sharp and sudden clarity. The survivors were close enough that the stale warmth of their exhalations had seeped into the stone. He lifted the lantern higher and saw the corridor widen into a damp chamber where the old bricks gave way to reinforced concrete, the entrance to the unregistered shelter nearly swallowed by a slab of fallen masonry. Through a narrow hand-wide gap between broken stone, he glimpsed movement, then the glint of an eye, and finally heard a wavering plea for help. The sound struck him with the force of a physical blow. In that moment, every instinct to calculate, measure, or doubt gave way to a singular certainty. These people were alive, waiting in darkness, and the responsibility to reach them fell squarely on him. Churchill knelt beside the obstructing slab, examining the cracks radiating through it like veins. Ellison joined him, tapping carefully along its surface and muttering about the precarious state of the fractured supports above. They both knew that moving the stone risked triggering a larger collapse, but doing nothing meant the trapped civilians would suffocate. Churchill ordered a controlled lever operation, insisting on quiet, gradual pressure rather than brute force. The team assembled an improvised fulcrum using a bent iron rod and a salvaged wooden beam, and as they positioned it, Churchill oversaw every angle with the intense focus of a man who had once studied blast patterns not for engineering but for survival. When they finally applied pressure, the stone shifted with a deep grinding groan that sent dust cascading around them. The ceiling threatened a response, creaking sharply before settling again, and Churchill froze, listening with every nerve alert. Only when the silence held did he order a second push. This time the gap widened enough for a small hand to reach through. Shaking, soot-covered, desperate, Churchill caught immediately and guided the first survivor, a young girl barely 10, through the opening. He steadied her as she emerged blinking into the lantern glow, then passed her to one of the rescuers. They continued widening the gap, coaxing out an elderly man, a dazed mother clutching her unconscious son, and several others whose faces bore the stunned disbelief of people pulled back from the edge. But as the last two remained inside, one a woman supporting an injured man whose leg was twisted unnaturally, Ellison warned that the passage needed another 2 inches. Churchill nodded for them to proceed carefully, but before the lever could be fully repositioned, a violent crack exploded overhead. The entire corridor shuddered. Dust burst downward in a choking cloud. The lantern swayed wildly as the ceiling groaned in a long, tortured warning. Churchill shouted for men to brace the sagging beam, and the rescuers lunged to thrust supports beneath the trembling structure. For a moment, the entire passage trembled between endurance and collapse, the stone above them giving the impression of a living thing straining under unbearable weight. Churchill positioned himself between the breach and the trapped survivors, poised to pull them out or shield them if the ceiling gave way. In that suspended heartbeat, he understood fully that retreat was no longer an option. Commitment had carried them past the threshold where safety could be reclaimed, and now only resolve, and whatever strength the failing structure still possessed, would decide whether they would walk out alive. The tremor that shook the corridor did not fully settle. Instead, it lingered in the air like a hell breath, as if the ruined building above them were deciding whether to tolerate their presence a little longer or crush them without warning. Churchill remained crouched near the breach, lantern casting long shadows over the angled slab and the strained supports that now groaned under the sudden shift. Dust floated to the beam of light in slow, drifting spirals. Behind him, the rescuers waited in a tense silence, their bodies poised to react, but aware that any hurried motion could finish what the tremor had started. Churchill felt the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders like an invisible load. He knew they were still at the mercy of forces they could not see, yet he also sensed that hesitation would doom the injured man still trapped inside the shelter. The woman at his side whispered something to the man she supported, her voice calm despite the fear etched across her face, and Churchill felt a surge of respect for her quiet strength. Fear was everywhere in this corridor, but was fear managed, contained, harnessed into a stubborn refusal to surrender? Churchill examined the slab again, taking time to observe every crack, every corner where the pressure shifted. The ceiling's groans above him had a new pitch, strained, but not actively collapsing, suggesting that the rapid adjustment of the support beams had bought them a sliver of stability. He signaled to Ellison, who moved carefully through the narrow space, his tools clinking softly. The engineer's expression was drawn and pale, but his hands remained steady. He placed the vibration gauge against the wall and watched the trembling needle settle into a pattern that, while far from safe, was workable. "We have minutes," Ellison murmured. "No more. If we force the slab, it comes down on us. If we finesse it, we might gain the space needed." Churchill nodded. Minutes were enough. Minutes had to be enough. He turned to the men and kept his voice controlled, not loud but firm, ensuring that the calm in his tone carried more authority than any shout. "We widen the gap with measured pressure. No jerking. No haste. Follow Ellison's lead." The process began again, but slower this time, each motion deliberate. The beam supporting their lever creaked as the rescuers leaned their weight into it. The slab shifted, barely half an inch, but that movement renewed the ominous rumble above them, prompting Churchill to raise his hand sharply, halting all action. Silence returned except for the faint scraping of dust falling from a hairline crack. He listened with an intensity that brought him back to old battlefields, to nights when survival depended on recognizing precise timbre of danger. The corridor was stable enough for one more attempt. He felt it more than he reasoned it. "Again!" he ordered quietly. This time the stone responded with a slow, grudging pivot, widening the gap by the breadth of 2 fingers. It was enough. Churchill immediately looked to the woman inside. "Bring him forward gently," he said, offering his hands through the opening. The injured man groaned as she shifted his damaged leg. Churchill felt the tremor in the man's body as he reached in to steady him, and for a moment he sensed not only the pain, but also the fragile trust the man was placing in a voice he could hardly see. Inch by inch they maneuvered him toward the gap. The ceiling groaned again, louder, as though irritated by their determination. Ellison muttered a warning under his breath, but Churchill continued guiding the man, bracing his shoulders and angling his torso to slip through the narrow space. When the injured man's chest cleared the slab, 2 rescuers seized his arms and eased him out fully, lowering him carefully onto the corridor floor. The woman crawled out next, her breath catching as she emerged into the lantern's light, and Churchill helped her to her feet before she stumbled toward the rescued man. The moment the last survivor was free, the building made its decision. A deep, resonant crack echoed above them, followed by a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. Churchill felt the shift immediately, the kind of shift that preceded destruction. "Move," he commanded, and the rescuers sprang into motion, hoisting the injured man, gathering the others, and turning toward the path they had come through. The supports behind them strained audibly, and pieces of plastic began to fall like heavy snow. The corridor had served them long enough. Now it was failing. Churchill walked backward for several steps, lantern held high, ensuring no one was left behind. He saw the woman glance at him with a mix of gratitude and worry, imploring him silently to follow. Only when the last man passed did Churchill turn and hurry after them, boots skidding on loose debris as the groaning ceiling escalated into an unmistakable warning. The passageway quaked again, this time with a jolt that sent several men stumbling. Churchill steadied himself on the wall, feeling the deep shudder travel along the stone like a living pulse. They were close to the main breach now. He could see the faint glow of lanterns from the outer room flickering through the narrow bend. Ellison shouted instructions, urging the men to keep the injured survivor lifted carefully but briskly. When they finally crossed the threshold into the partially collapsed sitting room, the air felt different, still thick with dust, but spacious enough that collapse would not trap them instantly. Churchill emerged last, breathing hard, lantern shaking slightly in his hand. A second later, the corridor behind them gave way with a roar, the sound rolling through the ruins like distant thunder. A plume of dust burst through the breach, engulfing the room in a choking haze. The supports they had used splintered instantly under the weight, and the entire lateral passage collapsed into a heap of stone and splintered wood. Churchill watched it fall, his jaw set, not with regret but with a sobering understanding that they had crossed the threshold with seconds to spare. The men around him were coughing, some kneeling, some doubling over with exhaustion, but the survivors, every last one of them, were alive. For a moment, Churchill simply stood there, catching his breath, feeling the burn in his chest settle into a dull ache. The lantern's glow flickered across the battered faces around him, illuminating expressions of disbelief, exhaustion, and something quieter. Pride earned not through glory but through endurance. He felt that same quiet pride rising in himself. He knew they were far from safety. The building could still shift, still threaten them. But the hardest moment, the razor-thin decision between action and disaster, had passed, and they had chosen correctly. "Let's take them out," he said, voice low but steady. "Carefully. This place has already given us all the luck it intends to." And as they prepared to move survivors toward the open air, Churchill allowed himself a rare, fleeting breath of relief, one he would never speak of, but one he knew he had earned. The air in the sitting room felt marginally clearer, but the building around them remained a wounded shell, every surface coated in soot and dust that drifted lazily with each movement. Churchill took a moment to steady his breathing, feeling a faint tremor still running through the floor beneath his boots. The most dangerous portion of the rescue was behind them, but escape was not yet guaranteed. The walls continued to creak with the brittle impatience of a structure near its limit. The survivors huddled together in uneven circles, their expressions dazed as they struggled to adjust to the flicker of lantern light after so many hours of darkness. Churchill scanned their faces one by one, ensuring none were missing, and he felt a deep, quiet satisfaction settle into him. They had reached the living. Now they had to deliver them back to open air. Major Ellison knelt beside the injured man, checking his pulse and murmuring instructions to two rescuers who would carry him out. Churchill noticed the engineer's hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from sheer fatigue, and placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You did well, Major," he said, not ceremonially but sincerely. Ellison nodded, swallowing hard. The praise landed with more weight than he expected. Churchill turned toward the fractured doorway that led to the street. The way out was partly blocked by collapsed beams and a spill of loose masonry, but daylight seeped faintly through the cracks, a thin, pale invitation that felt almost unreal after the claustrophobic darkness of the passage. He instructed the rescuers to move in small groups, maintaining enough distance to prevent the weakened floor from being overwhelmed at once. The survivors rose slowly, leaning on each other or on the rescuers for balance. Churchill guided the woman who had supported the injured man, off his arm as she stepped carefully over a broken hearthstone. Her eyes were rimmed with red, but she held his gaze with surprising steadiness. "You came yourself," she whispered, not asking but acknowledging. Churchill nodded once. "There are moments when decision must become action," he replied. She didn't answer, but her grip on his arm tightened in understanding. The climb toward the exit felt longer than it was. Every few steps brought a new obstacle. A dislodged frame, a pocket of unstable debris, a sudden groan from the beams overhead that forced them to pause and wait until the building settled again. Churchill moved among the survivors with quiet patience, offering brief words of reassurance not as speeches, but as grounding points. He felt the strain in his knees and the ache building across his shoulders, but he pushed the discomfort aside. Fatigue was a luxury a leader could acknowledge only after the work was done. When they finally reached the threshold of the ruined doorway, cold air swept over them like a cleansing wave. The fog outside carried the faint smell of extinguished fires, but compared to the choking dust inside, it felt almost pure. Firefighters and wardens waiting in the square straightened when they saw the first group emerge, their expressions shifting from tense expectation to astonished relief. Churchill stepped aside to allow the survivors through, guiding them with a hand at the elbow, urging them toward the medics waiting near the perimeter. The injured man was carried out carefully, his breath shallow but steady, and a murmur rippled to the rescuers and volunteers as they realized every civilian had made it out alive. For a moment, as the lanterns dimmed behind him and the sounds of collapsing corridor faded into the distance, Churchill allowed himself a long exhale. The cold bit at his cheeks, and above the ruins the sky was beginning to pale with the first hint of dawn. The city was broken, bruised, exhausted, but still standing, and the people, ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure, continued to rise from the dust with the same stubborn spirit. Churchill stepped fully into the open square. His coat streaked with soot, his hat tilted slightly from the fall of debris. No speeches awaited him here, no cameras, no applause, only the quiet recognition between those who had faced danger together and lived. He watched the survivors being tended to, their breaths visible in the morning air, and felt something inside him steady. Duty had brought him into the ruins. Responsibility had guided him through them. But it was something deeper, something unspoken, that he carried with him now as the sun struggled to pierce the smoke-filled dawn. The first breath of morning settled over the ruined square with a fragile stillness, the kind that follows chaos but does not yet promise safety. Smoke clung low to the ground, drifting like a slow tide between broken walls and twisted lampposts. Churchill remained a short distance from the medics, observing as the survivors were examined, wrapped in blankets, and given water. The injured man was loaded onto a stretcher with careful hands, his leg immobilized, his expression distant but alive. Churchill watched the crew work with quiet competence, feeling a subtle but insistent pulse of gratitude for every pair of hands that had made the rescue possible. The city had been battered again and again, but its resolve, its relentless willingness to rise, never seemed to waver. He took a few steps across the debris-strewn pavement, boots crunching over shards of glass and charred timber. The cold morning air felt sharper now that he was out of the claustrophobic heat trapped inside the ruins. Volunteers moved past him carrying hoses, blankets, crates of supplies, all of them tired but unwilling to rest. One firefighter paused near Churchill, hesitated, then offered a stiff nod of respect before hurrying on. Churchill returned the gesture with a brief lift of his chin. He was not here to be recognized, but he understood the power of shared acknowledgement in a moment like this. Small, wordless affirmations that the night's suffering had not broken them. As he moved farther from the immediate chaos of the rescue, Churchill's mind began to process what had happened with the measured clarity that always followed intense action. He replayed the corridor's collapse, the narrow escape, the moment the first small hand had reached through the debris. These images would remain with him, filed among the many private scenes that shaped his resolve but never appeared in official reports. He knew the weight of leadership was not carried in the speeches or the strategy rooms, but in these unrecorded encounters, silent decisions made in darkness, where no applause could follow. He felt the familiar ache of responsibility pressing deeper, and yet beneath it something steadier pulsed. Affirmation. Amid all the devastation, he had seen the stubborn flame of human spirit refuse to go out. Near the edge of the square, he paused beside what had once been a row of shops. Only fragments remained. A broken sign, a doorway without walls, the faint smell of flowers still clinging to the remains of a bakery. Churchill brushed a layer of ash from his sleeve, studying the collapsed structures with a gaze that mixed sorrow with recognition. He understood that each ruin held a story, a life interrupted, a future altered. The city bore its wounds openly, but it also bore them with defiance, and he felt that defiance stirred something deep in him, sharpening his sense of duty, reminding him why this fight, this long and punishing struggle, could not be yielded. Ellison approached him quietly, clearing his throat before speaking. "Prime Minister," he said, voice hoarse from dust and exhaustion, "the structural team will take over from here. The area needs to be sealed off soon. It's still unstable." Churchill nodded, appreciating the engineer's composure despite the night's ordeal. "You and your men performed admirably," he said. "London owes you more than it will ever know." Ellison tried to brush off the praise, but the slight tremble in his lip betrayed how deeply it struck him. He saluted awkwardly before returning to coordinate with the new crews arriving at the site. Churchill remained where he was for another long moment, watching the pale sun struggle to push its light through the lingering haze. The survivors, the rescuers, the shattered buildings, each formed part of a tableau he knew he would carry with him long after the rubble was cleared. The morning was cold, the future uncertain, and the war far from over. But the scene before him, bleak as it was, also spoke of endurance. Not triumph, not glory, simply the refusal to yield. He drew a slow breath and let it linger. Then, turning toward the waiting car at the far end of the street, he began the quiet walk across the broken square, the echoes of the night still following him but no longer weighing him down. The car waited at the far end of the ruined street, its dark silhouette barely visible through the drifting haze. Churchill walked toward it slowly, not out of fatigue, but because the weight of what it just witnessed, what it just survived, resisted being set aside so easily. The morning light continued to strengthen, filtering through the smoke in thin, golden shafts that illuminated floating dust like drifting embers. The city around him was quiet now, almost reverent, as though London itself were catching its breath after a night spent on the edge of annihilation. Every step he took brought back the echoes of the shelter, the girl's trembling hand, the crack of the failing corridor, the raw urgency of lives suspended between darkness and survival. These memories stitched themselves into him with sharp, unyielding clarity. As he passed a partially collapsed wall, he paused to study the exposed interior of what had once been a family's living room. A child's toy train lay half buried in rubble near an overturned chair, its metal frame bent, its paint blackened by soot. Churchill crouched briefly, brushing away a layer of dust with gloved fingers. The small object felt heavier than it should, a reminder of the ordinary innocence that bombs had no regard for. He set it back down gently, almost ceremonially, before rising again. In moments like this, he felt the full contradiction of leadership, the need to carry a nation with unwavering resolve, even as individual tragedies carved themselves into his private conscience. These ruins were not symbols to him. They were wounds, real, immediate, personal. A warden approached from the street's far corner, helmet tucked under his arm, his uniform coated in ash. "Prime Minister," he said with a respectful nod. "The area is secure. Fire crews will remain through the morning." Churchill returned the nod, noticing the exhaustion etched into the man's features. "You've all done well," he told him. "Your work tonight gave the city more than safety. It gave it hope." The warden looked down as though embarrassed, but Churchill saw the spark in his eyes. Quiet pride mixed with a shared understanding that none of them had faced the night alone. He continued walking until the devastation gave way to a clearer stretch of road. The car door was already open for him, but Churchill did not enter immediately. Instead, he turned to look back at the ruined square, now buzzing softly with activity as medics and volunteers continued their tasks. Dawn had fully taken hold, the sky shifting from gray to a muted blue, though streaks of smoke still smudged the horizon. The light revealed details of lanterns it concealed, the jagged silhouette of broken roofs, the glimmer of shattered glass across the pavement, the exhausted determination in the posture of every man and woman still working among the debris. Churchill took in the scene with a solemn calm, allowing himself to absorb it fully before it slipped into memory. As he finally stepped toward the car, his aide, who had been waiting in tense silence, opened his mouth as if to speak, but then faltered, unsure whether the moment called for words. Churchill spared him the effort. "No need," he said quietly. "Not this morning." He eased into the seat, but before the door closed, he looked once more toward the ruins. The survivors were being loaded into ambulances, wrapped in blankets, their faces drawn but alive. The rescuers stood nearby, exchanging murmured accounts of the night, shoulders slumped yet spirits unbroken. Churchill knew he would have to speak to the nation soon. He would need to transform the night's terror into resolve, its destruction into defiance. He understood the delicate alchemy required. To acknowledge suffering without surrendering to despair, to ignite courage without diminishing the cost of courage itself. But for now, he allowed himself a rare moment with no rhetoric, no posture, no armor. In the quiet interior of the car, he felt the tremor of the night fade into a steady pulse, a reminder, not of his authority, but of his duty. As the vehicle pulled away, Churchill watched the devastated street recede behind him. The ruins did not diminish with distance. They stayed with him, etched into his thoughts with the same clarity as the voices trapped beneath the rubble. He carried them because he must, because a leader who forgets the faces and the dust cannot hope to guide a nation to the fire ahead. As the car wound to the battered streets, Churchill watched the city emerge slowly from the smoke of the night, its outlines blurred but unbroken. London seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Rows of houses stripped open, chimneys leaning at precarious angles, streets where fire engines idled beside heaps of rubble. And yet in every direction he saw movement. Volunteers sweeping debris from doorways, wardens guiding families toward temporary shelters, neighbors calling out names as they searched for one another in the settling quiet. The dawn did not erase the devastation, but it revealed something deeper, something the night's violence had failed to destroy. London endured. It endured because its people refused to bow. They rose in the cold morning light with their sleeves rolled, their grief acknowledged but not permitted to root itself in despair. Churchill leaned slightly forward in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him, as his gaze followed a line of civilians stepping carefully over broken cobblestones. He wondered briefly about their stories, what they had lost, what they still clung to, what private memories now lay buried beneath bricks. The rescue had not saved the buildings, nor restored the square to what it had been, but had returned a handful of lives to those who loved them, and in a war measured so often by loss, preserving even a small fragment of hope felt like a form of resistance itself. He rubbed a smudge of soot from his sleeve, noticing how the gray dust clung stubbornly to the wool fibers. It was fitting, he thought, that the residue of the ruins remained with him. Leadership demanded not distance but proximity. If he walked among the survivors, he should carry evidence of their suffering on his own coat. The car slowed as it approached a checkpoint where soldiers cleared debris from the road. One of them recognized the Prime Minister and straightened sharply, offering a salute despite the fatigue visible in every line of his posture. Churchill returned the gesture with a brief nod. As they passed, he saw a group of young cadets helping an elderly woman retrieve what little remained from a ruined home: a kettle, a few books, a framed photograph with the glass shattered but the image intact. He watched the woman press the picture to her chest and close her eyes, and he felt something inside him shift, not with sorrow, but with affirmation. This was why the struggle continued, not for grand strategy or political survival, but for moments like that, one person holding on to a piece of their life, refusing to let the war steal everything. The aide seated beside him finally spoke, voice tentative. "Prime Minister, shall we return to Downing Street? You need rest." Churchill did not answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the window, on the receding figures in the smoke, on the skeletal remains of buildings that had once housed laughter, routine, the peaceful unpredictability of ordinary life. Rest felt like a distant concept, one he could not yet claim. "Yes," he said eventually, though the word carried the weight of reluctance. "But there is work to be done first." The aide nodded, understanding that Churchill's mind had already begun shaping the message he would deliver to the nation. It would not be a speech of triumph. There was no triumph in burnt streets, but one of resolve, of endurance, of a quiet and relentless courage reflected in the faces of those he had just walked among. As the car turned onto a wider avenue, the smoke thinned enough for Churchill to see the pale gold edge of the rising sun. It cast long shadows across the debris and illuminated a line of silhouettes, clearing rubble with shovels and bare hands. The light touched the broken stones, warming their jagged edges, and Churchill felt the faintest stirring of something close to hope. Not naive, not blinding, but grounded in the tangible truth of what he had witnessed. Courage did not always roar. Sometimes it came in the form of a lantern held steady in a collapsing corridor, or a woman refusing to abandon an injured stranger, or a group of exhausted rescuers ready to follow their leader into darkness because the alternative was unthinkable. By the time the car approached Whitehall, the city behind him began to fade into the soft blur of distance. But the memory remained vivid. He would carry it through every decision yet to come, through every long night and firelit dawn. As he stepped out of the car, the cold wind tugging at his coat, he paused for one final moment to look back at the direction from which he had come. The ruins were not visible from here, but he could still feel them. Every crack, every groan of failing masonry, every heartbeat of survivors he had helped pull from the dark. Churchill lifted his chin, steadying himself. He walked toward the door of number 10 with slow, deliberate steps, not with the stride of a man triumphant, but with the quiet gravity of someone who understood the cost of courage and accepted its burden. The city needed his voice now. It needed his steadiness, his defiance, his belief that even in the deepest night the ember of hope could survive. And as the morning light strengthened behind him, spilling across the streets he had left, it felt as though London itself were rising, not unscarred, not unshaken, but unbroken.